to fill your life now.
Tahon si yosta kan jokwa. Na ya sungwawi ne sungwai disa isa ni ungwai ho tang. Na ne hadik do ni ungwai tage skata ne ni ondega. Na go and do the eta ne kan henu. I di na gan gai hon dakwa to no na gada gota ne on hand gai ho dekui. Da na go ya 21 dot that 21 take say that ne scanner I do no doing your heck. Da na go ya ni di ungwai tage ungwai yosi ne tona. Skade hotuan got ni gohan, eat dan do dia dan do dan it to deep now take don got ni gohan. And down the hiat to hawan jada di 19 no hat di no hankwa. To know he and toss it sat near eat on got they can hustle. To know the ungwat wahad and got ni go he stuck with. And down I eat net none what how it fire song got the walk then death is sat on isa hui honda. And down I did with what they know ya, skade and doan got ni go have what the tino ha, it tino hat sat when jade. And I got told ne agway with that hind down honey sungwa this side. Down it to deep ne I take don't go ni gohan. And down and it's at the way and I ongi who say you stuck with. Nai onki a toy and it I again to the tweet noni. I the hoping I can scan at Kahadohi. I to Hagon it one tapa net to the way. And down I did with what they know yet, Skada and do I want to go have what the Tino hand it's at the way. Down it to deep now they don't go ni gohan. And down there, ho wakashon go nine, nega so go we ho doing you. Nanga, we ho one and honadi honda, so go we ho canistani. I don't think eti soda had one and don't this hekai once got net tane takwa. And down the otne said watchia in the kakakwa. And down the otne eti soda soon kakakwa. And down it told yet there just a no wine. And I know we ho one it's at no ni honadi honda. And I did what do was on you. I saw one of the what end of the chat no ni honadi hon that's a kind yard. And I did what they know ya, Skada and doing what you go have what the Tino ha, ne awaken ne also one of the what the end of the chat no ni sa go we honda. Down it to deep now they don't want ni go ha. And down there so go ya tawa ne go ye new go they get the yuki and yada. To no to thank you sa no talk na tisai. Ne tisak don't know dear cha haina da. Na ya what hot doga ya toyana I go yatagon on the way it's all when jade and I said ne do ne da and I ha so go yatagwa ne ka yin yung go de get yung kian yado ne akui I got saying one ha ya go the year and dana o ne hode the question ne ka ne go ha gesso dana I o ne humaya dagwa ne said wakowana not ne skanya dayo na ne ha we ne hawana ne sungwai this side and dana I did with what no nya Skada and dog want to go have what the Tino hand it. A new good to get the Unki and Yado. And I got tone said walk one, not Nespania dio, on it to the now take don't want to go. And down that certainly I seen this and why this side. Night away, I went to get you saw and then soon I had it. To know had you got that what's out no top not this side. And I hear. Had it to look that what. When the day you was soon the day in the host at the hard in it, gonna one cross it. And I heard some go that's just in it, young go home with it, some go with it on the other tay walking. And I did go to his son to us on some go away for. And down I did what they know near Skada and dog what they go her, or said one of her neck going here, get her nog in it some way this side. Down it to deep now, they don't want to go her. Down it to new Nagamaka what Wayne and on the hand. So that is the traditional open done in an Onondaga language. And this is done before all of our ceremonies, our meetings, and small gatherings and large gatherings. And that's an acknowledgement of all the things that the Creator has given to us. So at first it starts out with just, so this is a really condensed version of the Ganahanyu, and for the sake of time. But I remember as a child sitting through probably a good 45 minutes to an hour listening to the Ganahanyu from our elders. So we learned a lot of patience back then as children. But so I start with reading we thank and greet each other as the people that have gathered here. Then we go on to Mother Earth and all the things that the Creator has put down for us to be peaceful as we walk about on Earth. We acknowledge the winds, the soft winds, and we know how harsh they can be. And we're seeing this today. Now, those harsh winds that can do a lot of damage. We acknowledge that and give thanks for the soft winds. And then we go up into the sky and we thank starting out with the thunders, which bring the rains, and they have certain duties. Well, we acknowledge the sun, our elder brother, the sun, who warms the earth. We acknowledge the moon, our grandmother moon, and she works with the waters and with the women to bring life into the world. We also acknowledge the stars. Although we have lost a lot of the knowledge of the stars, we still acknowledge that they are still doing their duties of dampening the earth. And then we have these, we acknowledge the what we call the four protectors, four messengers, and they watch over us as we walk about on earth, because we know there's a lot of dangers out there, and that we hope that when we travel, that we will return to our families and safe. And then we acknowledge one of the leaders who brought the messages to our people. And this was done over 200 years ago, when all the things that our white brother had brought to us, and his teaching of how do we keep our songs, our language, our culture, our ways of life, with all the things that our white brother has brought us. So we we acknowledge him with his message of Handsome Lake. And then we acknowledge the Creator himself, that he's still sending love to all our people every day and every night. And we have, he has given us a way to make things right for him. So that's basically a very, again, a very condensed version of the Thanksgiving address, words before else. We call it the Ganahanya, I think, thanking of all the things that the Creator has given to us. Thank you.
Situación de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, la eficacia y medidas de cumplimiento consagradas en la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, y pensar hacia dónde vamos en los próximos años. Para los pueblos indígenas de todo el mundo, que suman más de 476 millones, la senda para obtener el reconocimiento internacional de nuestros derechos individuales y colectivos, primero por parte de la Liga de Naciones y luego por las Naciones Unidas, fue largo y difícil. Los pueblos indígenas, con el apoyo de las ONGs y la academia, se reunieron en el grupo de trabajo sobre poblaciones indígenas con otros delegados de otras partes del mundo y representantes de los Estados miembros. Y juntos comenzaron a trabajar en los primeros borradores y negociaciones de la Declaración de la ONU sobre los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, que fue aprobado en 2007 por la Asamblea General. En los años transcurridos desde la aprobación de la Declaración de la ONU, el Foro Permanente para las Cuestiones Indígenas, el Mecanismo de Expertos sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas y el Relator Especial sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas se han involucrado en muchos procesos a nivel nacional, regional e internacional, de conformidad con sus mandatos, a fin de facilitar la relación entre los estados y los pueblos indígenas. Además, la Conferencia Mundial sobre los Pueblos Indígenas del 2014 encargó a la Asamblea General que iniciara el proceso destinado a mejorar la participación de los representantes e instituciones de los pueblos indígenas en las reuniones de los órganos competentes de las Naciones Unidas sobre los asuntos que les conciernen. Este proceso ha permitido a los Estados miembros y a los pueblos indígenas que se escuchen mutuamente las preocupaciones y prioridades sobre la importancia de acordar el reconocimiento formal de los pueblos indígenas en las Naciones Unidas. Mientras se sigue avanzando con este trabajo, ahora más que nunca, ante las desigualdades que quedaron al descubierto durante la pandemia de COVID-19, las Naciones Unidas deben tomar medidas para responder a la situación actual y hacer realidad la aspiración de los pueblos de todo el mundo. Es hora de renovar los compromisos, crear y replantear un nuevo contrato social para garantizar que nadie quede atrás, incluidos los pueblos indígenas. La hoja de ruta para poner fin a décadas de colonialismo y patriarcado deben guiarse por instrumentos internacionales como la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas, para lograr la Agenda 2030 para el desarrollo sostenible, para la paz y la prosperidad para todos en un planeta sano. En algunos países se ha avanzado en la aprobación de reformas legales para el reconocimiento de la condición jurídica de los pueblos indígenas, las lenguas indígenas y culturas, sus tierras y territorios y sus derechos colectivos e individuales. Pero también hay muchos ejemplos de gobiernos que toman decisiones sin la participación genuina de los pueblos indígenas para obtener su consentimiento libre, previo e informado. En demasiados casos se imponen políticas, programas y grandes proyectos de desarrollo. Tales acciones conducen a la criminalización de los pueblos indígenas cuando ejercen su derecho a la libre determinación, incluso sobre sus tierras y territorios. Es hora de pasar de la formalización sobre el papel a la puesta en práctica en materia de derechos humanos, para poner fin a la discriminación, al racismo, la opresión, la marginación y la explotación. En esta oportunidad, insto a los gobiernos de todos los niveles a establecer y fortalecer mecanismos con la participación genuina de los pueblos indígenas sobre la base de la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. Reconocer a los pueblos indígenas como pueblos distintos y no como grupos marginados y vulnerables, valorando su diversidad y sus peculiaridades por las valiosas contribuciones que realizan en beneficio de todos. Las lenguas indígenas, las prácticas culturales y la sabiduría indígena, combinados con la ciencia y tecnología, pueden contribuir a dar respuesta a las crisis climáticas, y los conocimientos tradicionales indígenas y prácticas sobre agricultura sostenible y saludable son beneficiosos para la soberanía alimentaria. Reconocer y apoyar a las propias instituciones y estructuras de autogobierno de los pueblos indígenas para empoderarlos, a fin de que tomen el control de sus propios asuntos en todos los aspectos de sus vidas, y volver a examinar y honrar los compromisos pasados para renovar y fortalecer las relaciones presentes y futuras, tanto como pueblos, así como naciones. De hecho, es hora de que los Estados miembros reconozcan que las luchas de los pueblos indígenas y sus organizaciones ya no pueden ser ignoradas como lo fueron durante la era del establecimiento de cada Estado-nación. Conmemoremos todos el Día de los Pueblos Indígenas, renovando los compromisos contraídos para la plena aplicación y puesta en práctica de la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas. Cuenten con el Foro Permanente para las Cuestiones Indígenas en este esfuerzo. Muchas gracias.
Indigenous peoples around the world continue to face overwhelming marginalization, discrimination, and exclusion. Rooted in colonialism and patriarchy, these profound disparities are sustained by a deeply held resistance to recognizing and respecting the rights, dignity, and freedoms of indigenous peoples.
Throughout modern history, indigenous peoples have been robbed of their lands and territories, of their political and economic autonomy, and even of their own children. Their cultures and languages have been denigrated and extinguished.
In recent months, the world has again been exposed to just some of the horror faced by indigenous communities at the hands of colonizers. Some nations have begun to address this heinous legacy through apologies, truth and reconciliation efforts, and legislative and constitutional reforms, but much more needs to be done. We need a new social contract, one that restores and honors the rights, dignity, and freedoms of those who have been deprived of so much for so long. Central to this must be genuine dialogue, interaction, and willingness to listen. We already have the tools we need to this, including the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples.
there is no excuse for denying the world's 476 million indigenous peoples self-determination and meaningful participation in all decision-making. Free, prior, and informed consent is central for indigenous peoples to exercise their own vision of development.
While recognition of the importance of indigenous knowledge grows, in particular in solving the climate and biodiversity crisis and preventing the emergence of contagious diseases, we must ensure that indigenous knowledge is owned and shared by indigenous communities themselves.
The United Nations system has a key role to play. On this International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, let us show true solidarity by working to end the grievous inequalities of indigenous peoples worldwide, to fully recognize the abuse they have endured, and to celebrate their knowledge and wisdom. Kazali, you are live now.
All right, my friends, good morning, or afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. Obviously, Tabeya in my Indigenous language, and respectful greetings. Happy International Indigenous Peoples Day, everyone. I'm so glad you joined us. Obviously, I would like to thank Chief Taudodaho Sethil from the Onondaga Nation for the traditional welcoming ceremony for the 2021 commemoration of the International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. I would also like to thank the distinguished UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres for the written message, and the chair of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, his message delivered by Irma Pineda Santiago, the vice chair of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. My name is Ghazali Ohurela. I'm an Indigenous rights advocate from the Indigenous Alifuru people of Maluku. I've been in the International Indigenous Peoples Movement for almost 20 years now, and I'm documenting my work and progress on the Go Maluku podcast. So that is why I'm very pleased to be the moderator for today's dialogue on leaving no one behind, Indigenous peoples, and the call for a new social contract. I am very appreciative of the Indigenous Peoples and Development Branch, Secretariat of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, in a division for inclusive social development at the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, for the invitation to do this. Obviously, welcome everyone. Before we start the conversation, let us know in the chat or comments where you're joining from. I already see people typing in where they're joining from, so please do that, so we have an idea who's joining us. Also, I would like to remind you of some technical aspects, obviously. For people who can join us today, this event is being webcast through the Permanent Forum's Facebook Live and Twitter account. Unfortunately, without interpretation. So if you're on Zoom, you can use the interpretation function. But feel free to share the live stream with your networks. This is a very important conversation that we're having in a few moments. And I also invite you to use the official hashtag that the Permanent Forum is using, hashtag Indigenous Peoples Day, as well as hashtag We Are Indigenous. If you have any takeaways, use the hashtag so that we know what your main takeaway is from this conversation that we're having. And obviously, like I said before, for people that are on Zoom, we have simultaneous interpretation, English to Spanish, and vice versa on this platform. Luckily, you won't be listening to me. I'll be moderating the conversation. You'll be joined by two amazing people. So I'd like to give a special welcome to my guest today, Ms. Maria Fernanda Espinosa Garces, President of the 73rd session of the UN General Assembly, former Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister of Defense of Ecuador, and Professor James Anaya from the University of Colorado Law School, former UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and international human rights lawyer. About the format, briefly, of this interactive dialogue. It will be very interactive. We have prepared guiding questions for our speakers. We'll allot some 10 minutes for discussion on each question. But you are invited. You're invited to use the Q&A function to ask your questions or make comments to the speakers throughout the conversation. I will be monitoring whatever comes into the comments, into the chat, alongside this amazing team at UNDESA, who will provide support in managing the Q&As as well. So that's enough about me. Hopefully you won't hear me talking anymore throughout this conversation. So let's begin. Maria, James, welcome to this conversation. I usually begin with a little bit of background provided by the guests themselves. So if you can spend 2 to 3 minutes to establish some context, what is your, what I call the comical episode 1 story of Maria or James, like what forged your path in advocacy and diplomacy? Please, Maria, if you.
Well, thank you very much, Ghazali. Greetings to Professor Anaya, of course. I cannot think of a better way to commemorate and celebrate each one of the 176 million indigenous peoples worldwide. And I want to, of course, thank the United Nations, UNDESA, the Secretariat of the Permanent Forum, in particular, Miriam Masakisa, for this very creative format of having a free-flow conversation, reflecting openly about what are the challenges, what are the dreams that indigenous peoples have around the world, but also the incredible contribution of indigenous peoples to build a fairer, a more inclusive, and a richer world. I always say that the best asset that we have as humanity is our diversity in all ways and forms. And basically, we are celebrating diversity, cultural diversity, epistemological diversity, and this diversity is, of course, connected to our world's biodiversity. You said, introduce yourselves, define yourselves, tell us a story about you. And I think I am a woman from the Global South that had a transformational experience. I am a linguist by training. One of my first jobs was to assess bilingual and bicultural education programs in my country, Ecuador, a long time ago. And I had also the incredible experience of working with one of the first ever projects of Debt for Nature swaps, which brought me to the Ecuadorian Amazon, and later to the other countries of the Amazon in South America, to work and live with indigenous communities. I very quickly understood that language was extremely important from a linguist eye, of course, but then I realized that language was about a whole worldview, that the connection of indigenous peoples of the Amazon with their natural environment, the way they, the spiritual world, the material world, the understanding of the most important questions for humanity were in a way there. I don't want to be an essentialist, but I have to say that really changed the way I started to understand the world. And that was in very early stages of my career, 35 years ago or more. That was a long time ago. And a long history of sitting and support the negotiation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I found friends for a lifetime. I found incredible women, especially like Myrna Cunningham, like Victoria Tauli Corpus. I discovered so many sisters in arms in a way for a long years until when the declaration was adopted in 2007. I had the privilege to be the foreign minister of my country and write and sign the instructions to vote for in favor of the declaration. That was perhaps one of the happiest day of my public service. And when I was a minister of cultural natural heritage of my country, I also had the privilege to push and support the establishment of the first CSW special declaration on the role of Indigenous women as well. And what I'm trying to say with that, Ghazali, is that my entire professional career, working for a small NGO, working from academia in public service, the common denominator has been my profound respect, my advocacy, and my commitment, my lifelong commitment to Indigenous rights and to a life with dignity for all of them. And of course, my beating heart goes with Indigenous women in particular. Remember, we just ended the Generation Equality Forum a few weeks ago in Paris. And I remember it was the 26th commemoration of the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action. And when I was asked, what were you doing, 26 years ago? What I was doing, I was working with Indigenous women of the Ecuadorian Amazon to help them and support them in their preparations to attend the Beijing conference. And I remember I wrote a piece in one of the US journals called Tracing the Beijing Conference from Below, where I basically share this story about basically learning as we were preparing and drafting an agenda and a position document of Indigenous women of the Amazon for the Beijing conference. I would like to stop there in saying once again that that has been the defining factor of my political commitments, of my role as a woman of the Global South, in a lifelong enriching long path and long way. And that brings us here to jointly and collectively celebrate and commemorate this very special day. So back to you, Ghazali, and very much looking forward to listen to Professor Anaya, of course.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much, Maria, for that very interesting introduction. Definitely. James, you're very well known within Indigenous Peoples Movement. I'm sure that people are interested to learn what forged your path. What is your comical episode 1 story?
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this discussion. And happy Indigenous Peoples Day, everybody. I've been observing the chat, and I've noticed quite a few of the folks that I know. So special hello to you, and of course hello to everybody who's participating, and thanks to DESA and to all those wonderful people within DESA who worked on organizing this event and this celebration. I'm happy to say a few things about myself. Like you said, a lot of people do know something about me, especially from my time as Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'll go back to when I was in law school studying to be a lawyer. I still wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life, but I did know I wanted to eventually try to make some kind of positive difference in the world. Growing up, I was instilled with a strong sense of right and wrong, and I was exposed to poverty and discrimination, and also from an early age, I was made aware of and valued my indigenous heritage rooted in the Apache and Purepecha peoples. So by the time I left law school, I knew I wanted to work on indigenous issues. I come to understand something about the global dimensions of the problems facing indigenous peoples beyond the tribes and communities with which I was familiar. And I came to believe that the skills I was acquiring as a lawyer could be useful in addressing solutions to those problems. Now, at the same time, having studied about the law and its relation to indigenous peoples, I came to understand more and more about the limitations in the legal arrangements within the United States, where I live and I'm from, and the limitations in those arrangements elsewhere as well. I also learned and understood about how, in many cases, the law has been an instrument of the oppression of indigenous peoples, for example, justifying colonialism and colonial arrangements and the taking of lands. So early on in my professional career, I joined in efforts encouraged by people who mentored me and guided by people who mentored me. I joined in efforts to reform the law as it affects indigenous peoples, while continuing to use those aspects of existing law that can actually promote justice for indigenous peoples and nations. But given the limitations in the law and policy at the domestic or national level, I started to turn my attention, along with many others, to advancing reforms at the international level, including through the formal human rights institutions of the United Nations and regional organizations. And along with many others, I participated in standard setting exercises, first at the ILO and then also at the UN through the efforts to develop and ultimately see adopted the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I was so privileged to come to know so many people involved and at the forefront of the indigenous rights movement globally who really nurtured me and helped me in my understanding of what could be done, what needed to be done to move forward. And along those lines, I have to say that through all my work, I've learned to always be guided by the wisdom of indigenous leaders and elders, and to always honor their work and sacrifices. And I've come to understand how indigenous peoples have contributed to addressing not just their own concerns, but also the problems facing the world more broadly, and how indigenous peoples have more to contribute in the future. And I want to stress how privileged I feel to have been able to do the work I've done and will continue to do. So that's a bit of my background and outlook. And again, I'm very thankful for the opportunity to participate in the discussion today.
I appreciate it, James. And while you were talking, people actually recall your visit to some countries. I see it in the chat. So don't think that we're not reading the chat. We're definitely reading it. So very appreciative for your kind messages, everyone. All right, let's jump right into it, because people came here obviously for the new social contract to talk about what it actually is. We have 4 guiding questions. So let me jump in right into the first question. What are the key areas that should be considered for building and redesigning a new social contract that serves the well-being of indigenous peoples and other excluded social groups in society? Big question, obviously. If I may preclude it with an easier question, what is a social contract? Because that's what people would like to know. What is a social contract? Maria or James, please, whoever feels would like to start.
Please, James, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. Well, it's interesting we're talking about using the term social contract, and I think it can be useful. The term social contract arose as part of the body of political theory in the 17th century Enlightenment era. We can talk about philosophers such as Rousseau and Hobbes, who at the time gave currency to that term and the idea behind it. In that context, it referred to the implicit or tacit consent that individuals grant to be governed as part of a society and to have their absolute freedom limited. And that consent is given in exchange for protection of certain retained rights and social order. This theory was juxtaposed against the long-standing ideas of, excuse me, monarchical government by divine right, which had been the dominating theory of government for centuries, of course. So today we can see the term social contract used more generally to refer to the explicit or implicit agreements members of a society or community make to establish the moral and political rules of behavior. And as we've heard in his recent speech and just in his recent statement that was read to us, the Secretary General referred to the need for a new social contract within society and at the global level to overcome the many problems facing individuals, peoples in the world today, including problems of inequality and marginalization of Indigenous peoples. So if we take the idea of a social context in our present context, it should be understood, I think, that most Indigenous peoples never did have or haven't fully consented to the social orders and or governmental authority of the states that have been thrust upon them. In fact, as we know, that is the problem at the root of the historical and ongoing oppression and marginalization faced by Indigenous peoples. So for Indigenous peoples, I think establishing a new social contract would be a remedy to the lack of initial consent to be governed by the states that have grown up around them, and would entail the construction of a new social order based on consensus and respect for those rights. And as stated in the Secretary General's statement, that new social contract, in this sense, should be based at a minimum on the terms established by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other international instruments.
Thank you, James. Maria?
Well, I think that I cannot agree more with James with the idea of having the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a basis for a new social contract. I think that that's the point of reference, but also the Sustainable Development Goals. And I understand when we hear over and over again that it is time for a new social contract. And why? Because after times of crisis, I think that there is a wake up in society saying we cannot continue in the way we are living. And basically, when we look at what is happening in the world, we see, these multiple crises converging. And we see, the climate crisis, the biodiversity extinction crisis, the inequalities crisis, the poverty crisis, the violence crisis, all coming together to tell us that we cannot put band-aids here and there, and we cannot just have fragmented responses. Is either you provide, health, or you work on education, or you understand how to build a plurinational state like my own and several others in my part of the world. But you need to understand, society as a whole from a holistic perspective. And a holistic perspective, I think that Indigenous peoples are the experts to understand interconnections, interconnectedness, the sense of community, the sense of collective purpose. And I think that's what the social contract is about. It is about dialogue. It is about intercultural, intergenerational dialogue to build something new. And I think that the COVID pandemic has been a magnifier of already existing inequalities, neocolonial practices and societal designs. We see, for example, in my region, in Latin America and the Caribbean, look at what has happened with the COVID-19 crisis. 620,000 members of indigenous peoples communities in the Americas infected with the COVID-19, and more than 15,000 indigenous persons have died because of COVID. And this is an indicator. And what it indicates is, yet again, in spite of formal decolonization, practices of exclusion, of domination, of racism, of lack of access to the fundamental human rights, such as the right to health, for example, the right to quality education that is culturally sensitive. These are very, very basic rights. And here we are watching the world and watching sometimes our multilateral responses being insufficient, and being insufficient because of greed, because of lack of generosity, because of lack of cooperation. And what you see in the world and in the multilateral responses that we are putting together to respond to this crisis, I think provides us an opportunity to really acknowledge that our world is dysfunctional, that we need to reinvent ourselves, that we need to redesign our democratic institutions, that we need to think about what the rule of law means, what indigenous people's participation means, what prior informed consent, this very important principle and right, means in the crafting of this new social contract. And to make the story short, a new social contract has to be intergenerational, intercultural, fully inclusive, all-encompassing, holistic. You cannot try to fix the economy if you don't fix the souls and minds of humans worldwide. If humanity does not reconcile with nature. So it is a whole. We have an opportunity to rethink the relationship between human society, the economy, politics, and nature. And I think that in my humble opinion, that's what the social contract talks about. It is a modern version of what Hobbes or Rousseau thought about, because we are living a very different world. And of course, I think we have to acknowledge where indigenous peoples worldwide stand in terms of inequality, in terms of inclusion, in terms of rights deficit. But at the same time, I think we have to really understand and benefit from the incredible wisdom of indigenous peoples from around the world. My opinion after all these years is indigenous peoples, of course, should be the architects of their own destinies. But more importantly, I think that so-called Western societies should benefit, learn, and be fed by the agency and the knowledge and the expertise and the experience of indigenous peoples worldwide. So indigenous peoples should not be only speaking about indigenous people's issues and rights, but really speak to the whole of society. And this, of course, it's not only the task of governments. we tend to do, and I have done that myself in the past, to say, here's the package and bring it to the government so they just fix it and do it for us. I think it's a whole of society and understanding, of course, and when we speak about society, we do not speak about a monolithic a collection of people. We speak about our diversity of cultures, of vision, of epistemologies, of understanding development. And that's what the wealth of humanities precisely resides in its diversity. And I know, and when we were exchanging, Ghazali, you were saying, some indigenous persons do not understand what the social contract is about. And perhaps it is not only a question that indigenous peoples around the world ask themselves, but we all ask ourselves, because there is a time also for creativity, for reshaping, for retooling our political systems and our social coexistence. Back to you, Ghazali.
No, appreciate it, Maria. Something that I would like to ask you as well. You already, both of you already alluded to it. The question that came in, and it's been coming in multiple times, like what went wrong with the old social contract, and maybe tagging into the kind of question is like, so what elements does this new social contract need to include, or key areas need to include, so that it benefits Indigenous people or serves Indigenous peoples?
If I could, so what went wrong with the old social contract? If we look at the way governments were ordered and the terms of the implicit or tacit agreement that established governance and the relationship between government and society, it was mostly exclusive of Indigenous peoples if we're talking about the states. And as I said earlier, the social contract that needs to happen now is not a reformed one, it's a new one for Indigenous peoples. So Indigenous peoples were able to remedy that exclusion of the past. And I think Maria Fernanda, and it's really wonderful to be sharing the stage with you, the virtual stage, makes a very important point that the social contract is one that is broadly inclusive of all of society, and not just has to do with Indigenous peoples, although Indigenous peoples have special particular interests in this idea of a social contract. We might think of the social contract having two dimensions in regards to Indigenous peoples. One is that relationship that Indigenous peoples have with the state, with the systems of governance around them, with the broader society, in the terms of the tacit or implicit agreement within that broader context, within the context, and the terms of moral and political behavior of the broader society itself, and the broader national and global societies. There are problems, as pointed out by the Secretary General and highlighted just now by Maria Fernanda, in the world that are seemingly intractable, that require deep reforms, reformulated arrangements, economic, political, social, to address the deep problems facing the world: inequality, pervasive poverty, climate change. We know what they are. And it is within that broader context that of the need for a new social contract in the larger sense, that we can think of Indigenous peoples and efforts to develop and reform their own relationships with society and the governance structures around them. But those two dimensions, I think, is what we're talking about and needed attention.
Yeah, definitely. I cannot agree more with James. In basically, I think that we are living, of course, everybody tells us the world is incredibly interconnected. We're all interdependent. And we are arguing now that the Earth system is a common heritage, and we're working towards that. I am an ambassador of the Common Home for Humanity initiative, and we are working towards a global pact for the environment, and we're trying to put the pieces together in a way. But I think that in spite of that we are more connected. Even, you know, when we say we are all connected, the virtual world is connecting connecting us all. But when you start thinking, for example, that half of the world, 50%, do not have access to internet. They're offline. You know, what is the kind of inclusion that we are talking about? What to do with this 50%? And when it comes to women around the world, 4 or 5 points percentage excludes them even further, you know, from access to be connected. And I'm saying this because I believe that this new social pact or social contract, whatever name we want to give to that new way of building forward better. I think that it is a time for reconnection, to reconnect. And what are the things that we need to reconnect? And I think one of the reconnections that we really need as humanity is connect the times and cycles of nature with the times and cycles of politics and decision making. You know, our political systems, our institutions are designed to think short term, to think in a very I would say pragmatic, short-term, immediate gains way. If you look at the political cycles in parliament, in public service and government, there is a complete disconnection with these cycles and the cycles of the life of society and the life of ecosystems. So I think that we need to really come to grips to reconnect the times and the cycles. And for that, again, this reconnection has to have, you know, the voice, the agency, and the wisdom of Indigenous peoples. I have touched and lived and shared how much, you know, the community cycles are connected to the cycles of nature. The decision making, the societal political structure within communities. And that leads me to a second area of reconnection. It is the reconnection of scales, and how the community and the local level can inform national decision making, and how national decision making can inform the global decisions that we take in the world, internationally, globally, multilaterally, and vice versa. If we ask how much the UN Declaration is embedded in the daily lives of Indigenous peoples at the local level, or how much the UN Declaration has transpired and be translated into national legislation, for example. So this disconnect, I'm not sure that that's the way to say it in English, but this disconnection between the scales of institution building, in democracy building, in scale reconnection, it's extremely important for this new social contract that we need to build. And I think that we are faced with a critical existential question. It's either we think about the next elections, or we think about the next generations. And this is a question that can, you know, be responded with common sense. No, but it doesn't happen in the real world. And I think it is time that to overcome short-termism, it is time to think about this holistic view and perspective, to again to reconnect the scales, to reconcile as humans, but also to reconcile humanity with the natural environment. And these are fundamental questions for this so-called new social contract, where we need to listen more, and when we need to learn more. When we discuss, and perhaps we will address this issue on UN reform, for example, basically, I always argue that there is a need for a built-in a listening machine. And in that, I think it's needed at all levels, at the national level, and when we design public policies, and when we take decisions, when we pass new legislation. This listening, the built-in listening machinery is so much needed for this new social contract that cannot exist without the voice and the agency of the almost 500 million indigenous persons from around the world, especially the younger generations. I'm very, I trust so much the opportunity of intergenerational co-responsible dialogue and co-building. And that's what we need here and now, a co-building. We don't have there is no plan B. We have to use this opportunity, this time of loss, of crisis, of reinvention, to really come up with something meaningful that requires the voice and agency of all of us. And again, this is not, we cannot, wait. It has to be government-led. Of course, the role, the engagement, the commitment of governments are so important. But the voices of we the peoples are so critical as well. The we the peoples, this incredibly powerful first phrase of the United Nations Charter. So back to you again, Ghazali.
Appreciate it. Maria, you talked already about the UN reform, listening, rebuilding, reconnecting. That's one of the main takeaways of what you just now talked about. So I would like to pivot to the UN reform. I think that you built a very nice bridge towards it. James, UN reform is coming up. What do you think the role of indigenous people should be in that reform? Maybe also tagging into your experiences as special rapporteur, as well as former advisor to the PGA.
Yeah, thank you. I think a predicate for the question is that the UN is in need of reform in many aspects. We talk about the need for revitalization of the UN General Assembly, the need for more efficient and streamlined processes in the treaty bodies and the Universal Periodic Review. And also we talk about the need for enhanced participation of indigenous peoples at the UN. There's so many different dimensions of this reform issue. I think that indigenous peoples, and I say this humbly, and as a matter of my own opinion, and part as a matter of strategy, I need to prioritize enhanced participation in the United Nations system. These other aspects of reform touch upon indigenous people's concerns, but not as, in my view, importantly, as the need for indigenous peoples to have a proper place within the UN system, and not to have to fit within that that category of NGO or simply individual participants or experts, these existing categories that don't adequately capture the place of indigenous peoples in the world, indigenous peoples' rights, their real status, and what should be their place within the United States system, this system of we the peoples that Maria Fernanda referred to as articulated within the UN Charter itself. Now, as recall, the the outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, the General Assembly resolution that embodies that outcome document. It called for examining methods for enhancing participation of Indigenous peoples within the UN system, and indeed the GA authorized, the General Assembly authorized a process for examining and moving toward a system of enhanced participation. Now, I, along with my good friend and colleague Claire Charters, were named by the then President of the General Assembly as advisors in that process. And the process made some progress, I guess you could say, by providing a platform for the airing of views, concerns, but unfortunately, nothing concrete yet has come out of that process. I'm hopeful that something will. I'm hopeful that the momentum gained thus far will carry forward. But to me, this is the key reform for Indigenous peoples, because once having enhanced participation, enhanced status, then the ability to participate in the forging of the reforms in these other areas is enhanced manyfold. And so in my view and my opinion, and as partly as a matter of strategy, this should be the priority, that is enhancing participation of Indigenous peoples through an enhanced status within the United Nations system. And it's in my view, it's really it represents an incongruity within the UN system. United Nations has acknowledged Indigenous peoples as people with rights of self-determination. As we know, through the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We have all those documents within the UN system, the outcome document, others that reiterate this recognition in the abstract, but yet when it comes to actually operationalizing that status within the UN system itself, that hasn't happened. And so the UN itself, the UN system itself, is not in compliance with its own standards. And there is a deep need for the UN to make good on its own promises.
Yeah, well, I think that basically, as always, I think that James said it all in a way, but when we look at the UN ecosystem, which is extremely complex for a regular citizen from around the world to understand how the treaty bodies operate, how the special rapporteurs work, how countries report on the universal periodic reviews on their human rights commitments, now how governments report on through the VNRs, the voluntary national reviews on progress regarding the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. It is a very complex ecosystem, even more complex than the tropical rainforest ecosystem. But basically, I think that this pending homework that we have, and the pending homework is how to institutionalize a building mechanism to ensure the voice and in meaningful participation of Indigenous peoples in the multilateral architecture as a whole. And as James mentioned, of course, there is the permanent forum, which it's a very important platform. But basically, the Indigenous Forum is, even though it's extremely important, it's Indigenous leaders and intellectuals talking to each other in a way, with very little participation and engagement from member states sometimes. That has been my experience. And in basically Indigenous peoples, leaders and intellectuals and professionals talking to Indigenous peoples' issues. But I think that if we are serious about this new social contract, we need this building institutional machinery, which provides indigenous peoples with a special status. When I say this, it's not that civil society and the NGO community has their participation deficit solved. It is not happening. Also, I mean, that there is a big challenge. That's why the Secretary General has called for a inclusive networked multilateralism. And we cannot think about an inclusive network multilateral system if indigenous peoples do not have a voice, do not participate and engage actively. And yet again, not only to discuss about the indigenous people's agenda, which is very profuse, very diverse, very important. It varies from region to region. In some region, the issue of land rights and in land security is critical. In other parts of the world is political participation, livelihood struggles, is the right to self-determination, is a profound legal reform on countries like, for example, there is a plurinational de facto situation, but it's not fully recognized like constitutions like the Bolivian constitution or the Ecuadorian constitution do. So basically, I think that there's a long way to go to address, in my opinion, two of the great deficits of the multilateral architecture. And one is the implementation deficit. Even though if we look at the World Conference outcome document, there is a very direct call to all the UN programs and agencies to support countries in landing the UN declaration in their own national legislations and policy decisions and planning architecture. And I don't know, and perhaps you know better, but how many countries have used the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and translated into national legislation, for example, or have used it as a planning and policy design tool? I think that there are very, very few. And I think that we really need to speak to this implementation deficit. When I was the president of the UN General Assembly, I passed, I think, close to 400 resolutions under the umbrella of the General Assembly. And my concern is what has happened since, how much implementation, how much translation into policy at the national level, how much these 400 or less, little less resolutions have transformed and improved the lives of people. The phrase, the motto I use for my presidency is making the UN relevant for all. The issue of relevance, the issue of really making the multilateral work improve the quality of life, improve the rights and the human rights standards at the local level. That's what it's all about. And I think that we again need to reconnect and address seriously this implementation deficit. And the other, I said two important deficits. One is the implementation deficit, basically that comes together with accountability and monitoring and serious monitoring mechanisms. And for that, again, the voice, agency, and participation of indigenous peoples is central. And the number two, I would say it's the inclusion and participation deficit. The multilateral system is based on an intergovernmental architecture, and I think that there is no doubt. But in order to make decisions that have the legitimacy, that have the strength, the power, the social ownership, you need the participation and the voices of we the peoples. And here, I think that it speaks very much of perhaps a third deficit that just came to mind, is a trust deficit in institutions in general, worldwide. And I was in shock, a few weeks ago when I looked at the Latino Barometro. No? It's a mechanism to measure confidence of society in public institutions. And Latino Barometro, basically, I think it is the confluence of inequalities, exclusion, concentration of political power, poor economic performance, basically has pushed, to increase this trust deficit. And the numbers are scary. Basically, the numbers say that in Latin America and the Caribbean, 81% of the population considers that income distribution is unfair. 77% considers that our societies in the region are governed in the interest of a few wealthy and not for the good for all. 80% consider that access to justice is biased, and 60% say that access to education is unequal. And to add to that, 80% of the population do not believe in political parties in their political systems. And I think it's something that we need to ask ourselves. How is that we can counter this trust deficit in democratic institutions, in politics? And I think that the role of the multilateral system, the United Nations, delivering for the people in need is extremely important. And for that, we need to redesign, refresh, retool, modernize the United Nations. And I think that we have so much expectations of the upcoming report from the Secretary General called Our Common Agenda. And this report was mandated by the UN 75th political declaration, the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, now the 76th anniversary. I think the time is ripe to rethink, the institutional structures. 76 years have passed. The current geopolitics, the current world, the processes of decolonization, everything has changed. When the charter was first signed, we had 51 countries, subscribing the UN Charter and being part of this new League of Nations. Today, we have 193 countries, a geopolitical landscape that is so different, in a social energy, vitality that is so much needed as we think the new multilateralism, what I call multilateralism 2.0. And the new retooled multilateral system cannot be without the voices and the agency of indigenous peoples, with a proper built-in institutionalized inclusion and participation machinery. And we still have this pending homework. During my presidency, and I think 2 or 3 times we have had these interactive dialogues, these conversations to discuss on the participation modalities. But now I think we have enough elements to have already with a piece that can be discussed and agreed upon. It is so much needed if we really want an inclusive and networked multilateralism, as the Secretary General has called for. Back to you, Ghazali.
Thank you so much, and I think that that neatly segues into the the other guiding question that that we're going to use today, is like, what new roles can Indigenous peoples, civil society, and academia play to ensure that building back better after COVID-19 is based on agreed principles and rights? Like, what is the role of Indigenous peoples in confronting climate change? Also, I'm sure that a lot of people have already seen that the IPCC report came out today. It's very disturbing, and people are now more than ever looking at Indigenous peoples about their guidance, about their knowledge. Any thoughts on the new roles that Indigenous peoples can play, making sure that we come out better out of coming out of COVID-19?
Yeah, I guess it's my turn to speak. Yeah, I entirely agree that there is a huge implementation deficit. We have these standards that have been articulated in by the United Nations system, but then at the national local level, we have a big, there's a lot lagging behind in terms of actually seeing those rights realized. And a lot of more effort needs to be put forward at the local and national level to see these agreed principles and rights actually take hold and implemented. Of course, COVID has been a bit disruptor. It's made processes that were already in place a stall, partly because of shifting priorities, or but there's a need to turn back to with the new awareness that COVID is brought to the plight of many with the inequalities in the world. There's a need to turn back to implementing these agreed principles and rights with regard to Indigenous peoples through real practical measures. Part of that is seeing reforms in legislation and constitutions. Canada just last month joined those very few states that actually has adopted into legislation in some form the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. That's a very good development. We see other countries engaged in constitutional reform processes. Ecuador, of course, around 2010, 2011, very important processes. Bolivia has been mentioned. Currently, Chile and Mexico are looking at reforms in constitution. So these are very important developments, and they help build this new social contract that we're talking about. But a lot more needs to be done, and beyond legislation and constitutional reform to actual programmatic change on the ground. And of course, in the participation of Indigenous peoples in these developments to see rights implemented is key, as Maria Fernanda emphasized. Without that participation, the arrangements that are ultimately pursued cannot work. The legitimacy depends on the participation of Indigenous peoples, but the need to operationalize the rights and principles that have agreed upon is apparent. And there is so far been a lack of sufficient political will across the globe. Like I said, we've seen certain positive developments, but overall, a lot more needs to be done. And beyond seeing Indigenous people's specific rights being implemented through concrete efforts, more needs to be done to involve Indigenous peoples in confronting these broader issues like climate change and the food crisis. And I think it's been manifested in many different ways. The way that Indigenous knowledge can be brought to bear in a positive way to addressing problems with climate change and food crises. Revitalizing Indigenous people's own agricultural methods, or allowing Indigenous peoples to do that, supporting that, can go a long way to addressing the food crises. Going back to some of the methods, or allowing Indigenous peoples and supporting their efforts to go back to some of their agricultural methods can be beneficial. Taking advantage fully of Indigenous knowledge with regard to the natural landscape and its relationship to the climate is important. So that's an important dimension as well.
I appreciate it, James. Maria, before I go to you, can you also explain, because there's a question, can you explain what is an implementation deficit? So people are asking what that exactly is. Very much appreciate it.
Well, I think that James has just explained what it means. It means that there is a lot of effort in shaping decisions, resolutions, the very UN declaration, which is a historical landmark. We have laws and policies and regional, there is the Inter-American Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights, the UN. We have a series of legal instruments, of policy guidance instruments. But then when it comes to actually implement, transform, use all these mandates in pieces of either international law or pieces of international political guidance into the national level, there is a gap. And even when you have proper national legislation, or you have in your constitution a declaration that you are a plurinational state, in reality, it does not happen in terms of the rights, the livelihoods, the political participation of Indigenous peoples worldwide. There is a profound gap between policy and action, policy and decision making. Let's ask in terms of public investment, how much money goes to Indigenous peoples worldwide? What is the part of the budget that goes directly to Indigenous peoples? So speaking about public budgets, let's say. So there is a disconnection again between law and policy, and between policy and action. This shortage of action and shortage of investment, the shortage of rights, it's what we call this implementation deficit. Going beyond words, we have this phrase, deeds, not words. Action is what we need, and how to measure action is extremely important. So again, the role of accountability, of monitoring, it's extremely important. And I think that that's what the social contract needs to be about. I'm a big defender, as a linguist, I'm a big defender of words and the power of words and the power of narratives, of course. But I think that words need to be translated into improving the quality of lives of people on the ground. In this case, the quality of life of Indigenous peoples on the ground. And you look at any indicator, take the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and just factor in the indicator of Indigenous person or Indigenous community, or in the case of my country, Indigenous nationality, and let's look at numbers of poverty, at numbers of malnutrition and hunger, access to education, impact of climate change. What are the most vulnerable communities? And believe me that then you will have the answer. And the counterpart of that is look at the contribution of Indigenous peoples, for example, to fight climate change, adaptation innovations, resilience building. When we look at COVID even, let's look at FILAC's platform on COVID. It's incredible good practice, an example for the world, in how, self-reliance, community organization, traditional medicine and traditional knowledge, collective forms of organization have been key to resisting to the COVID-19 pandemic at the community level. In FILAC, look at COICA and the efforts of indigenous peoples of the 8 Amazonian countries and how they have organized themselves to counter the COVID pandemic. And so that's what we mean by this gap between policy practice, knowledge practice, the connection between the communities of knowledge and the communities of practice. I mean, this is the kind of divides and disconnections that we need to overcome. Deeds, not words, basically. That would be the short answer to the question.
Also, a very important part of this conversation, and you and James already spoke at length about it, as well as multilateralism. So what is the role of multilateralism in reimagining imagining or designing a new social contract that strengthens the inclusiveness and responsiveness of institutions to achieve the 2030 agenda? How do we improve the accountability, delivery, and efficiency of the multilateral system as a whole? Any big question, however, any thoughts on that?
Well, Maria Fernanda has already spoken quite eloquently to the need to reform multilateralism, including within the UN system. And I totally, wholeheartedly agree with those comments. You know, this is a different world from when the UN Charter was adopted in 1945, and not only has the world changed in fundamental ways, such as including the global South in a more robust way than it was before, but also in terms of values. The kind of political arrangements that were in place in 1945 that were acceptable then are not acceptable now. The understanding of the rights of indigenous peoples is a prime example of how the world has been more expansive in terms of, developed more expansively in terms of understanding the rights and values of different segments of the world's population in a more progressive and just way. What I would say, the role of multilateralism can be, if we think of it in a reimagined, more adequate to the current circumstances way, is to see multilateralism be more, a lot of people don't like this word, but I think it's useful, to be more pragmatic, to actually address problems, to be able to be more streamlined, not so duplicative, for it to have be able to deploy more efficiently support, including financial aid, to local initiatives and also the initiatives of indigenous peoples. I think the current multilateralism that we see produces a lot of paper. There's a lot of talk. Now, I think talk is good. I think, understanding about issues, problems, and values can shift with a lot of dialogue. And we saw that over the years and decades preceding the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We saw attitudes among governments shift towards one of accepting the right of self-determination of indigenous peoples and accepting indigenous peoples as peoples from a position in the 1980s, early 1980s, mid 1980s, and before that, of rejecting that notion. So dialogue is good, but and resolutions and studies are good, but I think what we've learned is that more resolution, more documents, more studies is not the solution. There needs to be a pragmatic, action-oriented orientation to multilateralism, in my view, especially if we're going to see real change happen toward the implementation of the 2030 agenda, which really is a quite bold agenda, speaking to the need to address and eradicate poverty, to uplifting countries whose economies are suppressed, or the need to address climate change and the other issues facing humanity, including issues having to do with the conditions of Indigenous peoples and lack of respect for their rights. Very action-oriented methodologies need to be developed, and institutional orientations need to be implemented for multilateralism to really work to address the world's needs today and the aspirations and rights of Indigenous peoples. And this fits with our discussion about the implementation gap. The multilateralism of today produces more paper, produces more dialogue, some of it useful, but a lot of it repetitive, in my view. The multilateralism needs to be more action-oriented to bridge that implementation gap, and to see the rights that are referred to in these documents, the rights of self-determination, the land rights of Indigenous peoples, actually implemented on the ground, actually operationalized on the ground.
Yes, well, definitely. I think that, as I was saying before, if just go through the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and just add a filter, and the filter is Indigenous people's rights and the UN political and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Just building and put them together, and you will see what you find. And unfortunately, what we will find is not very encouraging. And look at how countries report back through their voluntary national reviews on progress towards achieving the 2030 agenda. And so few, countries have indicators on Indigenous peoples' rights. And it's really worrisome, because I think that one of the challenges is data and proper information. And I am a commissioner of the Lancet Commission on COVID. And we have done a lot of research and tried to gather data on COVID and Indigenous peoples. And it's so difficult to have disaggregated data, good quality data, proper information. And that's also the responsibility of states, but with the full engagement of Indigenous peoples. And in that, I think it's one of the issues that we need to tackle and address seriously, the data and quality information gap. Otherwise, you cannot measure, you cannot compare, you cannot understand what is that you should be doing better. And that's, in my opinion, one of the challenges. And the other challenge, I would say, is that what are the Sustainable Development Goals that are relevant to Indigenous people's lives and rights? And I think it very much depends on the agenda, and very much depends on the priorities, and very much depends on a cultural reading of the right to development of Indigenous peoples worldwide. And I think that perhaps this exercise that the UN Forum does should be precisely that, a proper reading of the 2030 agenda through the eyes of Indigenous peoples worldwide. And in doing that, making sure that this Indigenous worldview of the 2030 agenda is, comes to life when decisions are taken. At the community level, but at the national, at the regional level as well, and at the UN level as well. So I think that there is a lot of pending homework. As I say, there is this paradox, because On one hand, the numbers are not very promising if you look at indigenous peoples. But on the other hand, the potential, the creativity, the intellect coming from indigenous peoples is so much needed for this new social contract, whatever name you want to give it, but this new social I wouldn't say scaffold, this new agreement, this new opportunity to reconcile, I heard the Secretary General once said, we need to make peace with nature, but I think we need to make peace among ourselves. And if this is called a new social contract, perfect. And for that, I think we really need a multilateral architecture that reflects that reflects the situation, the conditions, the geopolitics of the 21st century, the decolonization processes that happen after 1945. They need to be properly reflected in this new multilateral architecture. And as we think about the UN for the future generations. And we are given an opportunity, as I repeat constantly, this is a whole of society effort. It's not only the responsibility of member states. It is about the voice of indigenous peoples, of civil society, of academia, of the scientific community, of the private sector. And I believe that the private sector and the philanthropic community, they both have a critical role to play in a very horizontal and respectful dialogue process and co-building process as well. So there's a lot, I don't like to be very prescriptive, but I do think that when we speak about building forward better, building back better after the pandemic, we really need to sit down and have a checklist that we all agree upon. Because, you know, it's as when we speak about sustainable development, it can mean, you know, if we ask here, if I ask you, Ghazali, or, you know, everybody, the audience that is following us, more than 500 people, we all would have perhaps a different response, a different way to describe sustainable development. In the same way, I think that when we speak about building forward better, we need to come up with minimum common denominators that are centered in human dignity, in human rights, in the main instruments like the UN Declaration, and say these are the fundamentals for the world of today. And in use, of course, the very useful framework of the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda. And again, is so worrisome that we commit to so many things, but when it comes to numbers and data, it doesn't reflect, you know, the effort and the outcome. Usually there is a sort of a disconnection in between. And we have seen that with the IPCC report that came up today. It's so worrisome. And we know that who suffers from the climate crisis, who suffers from the climate destabilization, the small island developing states, the vulnerable populations worldwide. The millions of climate refugees are increasing worldwide. And let's hope that these multi-millionaire stimulus packages that we're seeing, especially in the industrialized world, really are translate into greener, more inclusive development. And because we cannot have the same old system, same old way of behaving, the same old way of taking decisions. Concentration of power and wealth is it hurts when you look worldwide, and I think we need to do something about it.
Yeah, very well said and eloquently, and as you see people on the chat and also in the comments on live also like responding to it very well. We're coming, unfortunately, towards the end of this conversation. I have one more question, and perhaps we can take one or two questions from the audience as well. We talked about social contract, and you, Maria, again, you did a very nice bridge towards it. This new social contract. Let's say these people are sitting at home watching this, and they're trying to get their minds right, or they're trying to understand what this whole new social contract is. How can this new social contract best support Indigenous peoples and their plight towards peace and development?
I'll let Maria Fernanda go.
Okay. I think that the contribution of Indigenous peoples to a culture of peace is so critical. And when we speak about different forms of violence, it is not only conflict related, it is not armed conflict. It is structural violence of exclusion, of discrimination, of rights and human rights deficit. And I think that when we're talking about this new social contract, it is about understanding, about solidarity, about cooperation, about truly building a culture of peace. And basically, I think that peace is a precondition for societies that are more equal in that live in harmony. And sometimes when we're asked what comes first, what comes first? You need to build a culture of peace in order to narrow the multiple inequalities gap. What comes first? And I think that they all come together. A true culture of peace comes with a world that is more equal, more democratic, more inclusive, more pluricultural and intergenerational. And at the same time, I think that there is no possibilities of culturally sensitive, sustainable development if we do not operate, decide, interact in an environment of harmony and mutual respect. And here I'm thinking about the dozens and dozens of Indigenous human rights defenders that are being killed in so many parts of the world. And I think that this is something that in this new world, in this new social contract cannot happen. And of course, there is this, if you look at conflicts around the world, unfortunately, what we see is that conflicts over access and control of natural resources, of strategic resources, and you name it, water, the impacts of climate change, of the biodiversity extinction crisis, issues of hunger and food sovereignty and food security, I really have profound impacts in the building of peaceful societies. And again, I think that inclusion, participation, respectful and horizontal dialogue, democratic institutions, inclusive institutions, including the United Nations, is a precondition for building peaceful and sustainable societies. And once again, the voice and agency of Indigenous peoples is not only a precondition, but it's much needed. It is much needed. I cannot think about a better world in the future without the voice, the intellect, the creativity that Indigenous peoples bring to the table. And again, not only on Indigenous peoples matters, but in world matters, in the way to overcome the current multiple crises that we have described many times today, but no possibilities of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, the 2030 agenda, including SDG number 16 on peace, justice, and strong institutions without the voice, the agency of Indigenous peoples. And here, I know that there are conflicting views on the political participation and engagement of Indigenous peoples. And I hear and I respect, of course, this point of view saying Indigenous peoples should devote their time to be, intellectuals, to be scientists, but they should not get into politics. And I think that unfortunately, power and the redistribution of power is critical. And the redistribution of political power is even more critical. And I am a full supporter of an active engagement in politics of Indigenous leaders worldwide, and the space for Indigenous women to be in positions of power. And I think that if we are talking about redistribution of power balance, the building of democratic institutions, I think we need to be serious about political participation. Political leaders at the local level, in Indigenous mayors, we had a big wave of Indigenous mayors that made the difference, but Indigenous representatives in parliaments, in governments, Indigenous representatives. I'm really looking forward to seeing, Indigenous ambassadors at the UN having a say in government and state matters. So I think that we should aim at that. And of course, I fully respect, because there's a whole, view that it shouldn't happen. But I think politics is a very hard world and environment. I can tell you firsthand, especially when you're a woman, it's very difficult. It's taxing. But it is needed. I think that it's something that we need to consider seriously, especially for the younger generation of Indigenous leaders worldwide. And I think we will have the chance, Ghazali, to have a few final words, but just to respond to your question, and I'm really looking forward to listening what James has to say on this particular issue.
Yeah, please, James, go ahead.
Yeah, I do believe a new social contract, and I think it's almost self-evident, it can support peace and development if it's based on respect and promotion of widely recognized human rights, and including the human rights of Indigenous peoples, as articulated in documents like the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Human rights, justice is a precondition for genuine peace and for the development, and that is a principle that I think has been widely understood. Going back to at least the UN Charter. The UN Charter itself envisions a global order and social orders within countries, based on equality and respect for human rights and self-determination of peoples. And of course, that's made explicit in the initial articles of the UN Charter and its founding purposes and principles, a world order and social orders based on respect for equality, human rights, and self-determinations of peoples. And I would extend that to self-determination of Indigenous peoples. Without respect for these rights, there can be no real peace. There will always be instability. History has shown us that, current developments have shown us that, and there can be no genuine development, because development, when we talk about development, it is development with respect for human rights, the very term and understanding of what we mean by development. So I do think that what the Secretary General is advancing, this notion of a new social contract, based on new arrangements that not only address the pressing issues of today, but do so on the basis of embedded values, the rights that are respected, can be conducive to peace and development more broadly, and indeed is essential if we're going to have genuine peace and development.
I appreciate it, James and Maria. Unfortunately, we're at the very end of our conversation. Hopefully, it was valuable to everyone. But I hate to leave without giving Maria and James some final thoughts, remarks, takeaways for people to consider. I don't want to impose time limits, but we don't have a lot of time. So, Maria, if you please could go first.
Well, it's, after this very rich exchange, and I've been reading the questions addressed by the audience, and perhaps if you allow me, Ghazali, just 1 minute to address one of the questions about intersectionality. And I think sometimes this concept is a little difficult to understand, but I think it's really important to say, in terms of exclusion, in terms of discrimination, in terms of inequalities, an intersectional perspective is extremely important. When I said just building a lens of Indigenous people's rights into the Sustainable Development Goals is, build in use a lens of when your ethnic, gender, disability condition come together. That is how poverty and equality intersect. Intersection of exclusion has to become an intersection of inclusion, of full engagement and participation. And really, when we address inequalities, we need to look at all these different aspects of different dimensions of inequalities, tinted by, as mentioned, by gender, by race, by ethnicity, tinted by disabilities, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that we will not be able to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals if we do not understand this intersectional dimensions of inequality. Just to respond to one of the questions, and my final words would be that we are given a golden opportunity to reconstruct, to rebuild, to redefine, to come up with a narrative and with a practice for a better world, because we are living at times of multiple crises. We have said that so many times, but it is a crisis that has to become an opportunity for building forward better, and for this new social contract. We are very much, as mentioned at the beginning, looking forward to the report from the Secretary General, to this our common agenda. And perhaps this our common agenda is a little bit of a synonym of this new social contract. And for that, I think that the principle of participation, meaningful participation, inclusion, different voices, diversity of opinion in this rebuilding process is absolutely vital. And again, the voice, the agency, the contributions of the Indigenous peoples are not only desirable, but are much needed, much needed. Cosmovision, spirituality, ways of understanding, institutional architecture, power redistribution. All of these are critical questions for the future of multilateralism. And the future of multilateralism can only be if it includes the voices of Indigenous peoples. So it has really been a privilege to celebrate with you this International Day for Indigenous Peoples and Indigenous Peoples' Rights. Just to say that there's a lot of homework to do. This homework is a whole of society homework, of course. And I will close with one phrase, which is deed, not words. And to close this implementation and trust deficit that we're living. The only way to do it is be engaged, participate, exercise your power as a citizen, as an Indigenous leader, as a community leader, exercise the power that you have in your hands. Thank you again, Ghazali and James. It has been an incredible, enriching exchange, and happy International Day of Indigenous Peoples. And my greetings, my solidarity, my love, and my redoubled commitment to Indigenous peoples from around the world. Back to you, Ghazali.
Thank you, Maria. James?
Yeah, it's been a great discussion. Thank you, Maria Fernanda, for all your wisdom that you shared and that I've learned from. Ghazali, for your moderation, and of course to the organizers for putting this all together. And again, I'd like to add my congratulations and to all those who have worked so hard to get the Indigenous rights movement where it is today. And my final word is really one that I've ended with in many of my speeches. Some of you heard me, and that is optimism. I think there's just as there is opportunity, there is room for optimism right now. And if all we need to do is look back to see how much progress there has been. 2 decades ago, that seems like a long time, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not. But just a couple of 3 decades ago, there wasn't this entrenched and strong recognition of the rights of Indigenous peoples to self-determination, to lands and resources, those rights that are expressed in the Declaration and repeated. And now it's fair to say they're entrenched in the international system. We're facing, the challenges of the implementation gap that we've talked about, but there's movement there as well. And it's because of the resiliency, creativity, resolve of Indigenous peoples themselves. And so I'm ever so grateful for that, for what Indigenous peoples have done, not just for Indigenous peoples, but for the world, and bringing the world to a better place, and what Indigenous peoples will continue to do in bringing the world to an ever better place, and participating in the construction of this social contract that we've been talking about, that will make for a better world. So I, for one, am optimistic, and I hope you all are too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James and Maria, for getting up early for this amazing conversation. Obviously, this is a conversation that could take on longer, but yeah, it is. We only have 1 hour, and hopefully, and that's what the idea is, that you also engage in a conversation, a dialogue about this, about the new social contract, at home, within the community, with your Indigenous leaders, with your governments. It is super important that we continue this dialogue. Obviously, I will not even attempt to capture or conclude, because James and Maria did a very fine job doing this. We have had over 1,500 people registering for this conversation. Right now, we're obviously people have to go to work, so over 500 have been participating, over 100 on Facebook. So this is an amazing turnout for a new concept that Print Forum is using on the world's International Indigenous Peoples Day. I would like to obviously thank you everyone, the speakers, for this conversation. And it's time to close this commemoration of the 2021 United Nations International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples. Obviously, a special thank you to this again to the speakers. I'm repeating myself 3 times already, but I cannot do it enough. The UN Secretary General for his message, Antonio Guterres, the chair of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, and the vice chair of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues to read out that important statement. Obviously, you have been, if you were on Zoom, you were enjoying the interpretation. So thank you so much to the Fund for the Development of the Indigenous Peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean. I'm sorry to the interpreters for me sounding like a machine gun right now. FELAC for their support in providing interpretation. Let me tell you that the guests, the speakers were adamant that interpretation needed to be provided. That people needed to be able to participate in this conversation. Thank you so much for your comments and for your questions. We could not answer everything, but hopefully it did stir up some conversation in the chat. So I'm very appreciative for that. So yeah, finally, thank you all. You and Dessa, Panel Forum on Indigenous Issues, everyone watching, for being with us today to mark this very special day for Indigenous peoples. Obviously, for Indigenous peoples, every day is Indigenous Peoples Day, but August 9th, and please continue enjoying the World's Indigenous Peoples Day, and hopefully catch you soon in person somewhere within the halls of the UN. Matibulu, thank you so much for your time, and have a great day. Stay safe and stay healthy.